Picture the UK a decade from now, running on roughly 90% clean power. What most people imagine is simple. More wind turbines, more solar farms, more batteries. Job done. So let's start with where that 90% actually comes from, because this part is genuinely good news. Official government projections for a clean power system put offshore wind as the single biggest contributor by far, providing roughly half of all generation on its own. Onshore wind and solar together add around another 29%. Add those up and wind and solar alone account for roughly 80% of the mix. Nuclear supplies a smaller but steady slice of reliable baseload power. And unabated gas, currently more than a quarter of what Britain runs on today, gets squeezed down to under 5%, kept mostly as a rare emergency backup rather than an everyday source. That shift is already properly underway, and it's moving at real pace. Wind alone already supplies close to 30% of Britain's electricity today, up from a small fraction just over a decade ago. The generation side, the turbines and panels themselves, is genuinely the easy part, and it's also the cheaper part. Offshore wind and solar are now among the lowest cost forms of new electricity generation Britain can build, and the projects already under construction or contracted are on track to deliver most of this shift on a realistic timeline. The part almost nobody pictures, the part that's actually harder and more expensive than building the wind farms in the first place, is what has to happen to the grid itself. Because you can build all the clean power in the world, and if it can't get from where it's generated to where it's needed, none of it matters. Start with the basic problem. Britain's grid was built for a completely different system than the one it now has to carry. The national grid was designed decades ago to move electricity from a handful of large centralised power stations to nearby towns and cities. The 90% renewable system replaces that with wind farms concentrated off the coast of Scotland and the North Sea, solar farms scattered across the south, and demand concentrated in cities hundreds of miles away. The electricity generation is becoming decentralised and geographically mismatched with demand, and the transmission network inherited from the last century simply wasn't built for that shape of system at all. Electrification makes this worse before it makes it better. As homes switch from gas boilers to heat pumps and petrol cars to electric ones, total electricity demand is expected to rise by around 50%. So the grid isn't just being asked to carry renewable power instead of fossil power, it's being asked to carry roughly half again as much electricity as today, from different places to different places. This is why Britain is currently running what's genuinely described as the largest overhaul of its electricity grid in generations. It's called the Great Grid Upgrade, and the numbers involved are enormous. Around 19 billion kilos committed through 2030 for transmission infrastructure alone, new pylons, substations, and subsea cables, with a further estimated $58 billion needed for the following 5 years to 2035. Physically, that means roughly 4,000 miles of new undersea cables and 1,000 miles of new overhead power lines, 5 times more electricity infrastructure built between 2023 and 2030 than was built in the previous 30 years combined. The single biggest piece of this is a set of subsea cables called the Eastern Green Links, running under the North Sea down the east coast, specifically built to carry Scottish wind power to the parts of England that actually need it, bypassing a transmission bottleneck at the Scotland-England border that's currently one of the biggest constraints in the whole system. One of these cables alone, Eastern Green Link 2, is a 500-kilometre, 2-gigawatt connection between Peterhead and Drax, the longest HVDC subsea cable in the UK, due to be operational in 2029. And this is genuinely controversial, not just expensive. Most of this new capacity has to arrive on land as overhead pylons, because undergrounding cables costs about 4.5 times more than overhead lines, and subsea routing inland costs around 11 times more. Costs that would either land on customer bills or delay the whole programme. The government has ruled out large-scale undergrounding as a result. That's produced real, organised local opposition in places like Norfolk, Suffolk and Essex, where communities are pushing back hard against new pylon lines cutting across the countryside. It's not a minor planning footnote. Delays to projects like the Norwich to Tilbury line have already pushed completion back a year, and the National Energy System Operator estimates every year of delay costs around $4 billion, mostly because generators have to be paid constraint payments to switch off wind farms that have nowhere to send their power. the grid upgrade isn't just an engineering project. It's also a genuine ongoing planning and public consent battle, and the pace of that battle is currently one of the biggest risks to hitting any renewable target at all. Batteries are part of the answer here, genuinely important, as we covered before, but they're solving a different problem to the one the grid upgrade solves. Batteries smooth out supply over hours, soaking up excess solar at midday, releasing it in the evening peak. What they don't do is move power hundreds of miles from a Scottish wind farm to a city in the Midlands, and they don't do much for a multi-day lull when wind is low across the whole country at once. That's what the transmission cables and interconnectors are actually for. New interconnector cables to France, Belgium, the Netherlands and Germany, projects like Nautilus and Lion Link, let Britain import power from wherever the wind happens to be blowing on the continent and export it back the other way when it's Britain's turn to have the surplus. A 90% renewable grid doesn't rely on any single fix. It layers batteries for hours, transmission cables for geography, interconnectors for continental scale weather diversity, and a smaller amount of low-carbon dispatchable generation, new nuclear like Sizewell C, among it. For the days, none of the above quite covers. And batteries doesn't only mean the huge grid-scale sites. Increasingly, it means yours. There's a genuinely fast-growing model called the virtual power plant, and the concept is simple. Pull thousands of individual home batteries, the kind people are already installing alongside solar panels, and coordinate them by software into something that behaves from the grid's point of view, like one large power station. Octopus Energy's Kraken platform already runs a virtual power plant of this kind at roughly 2 gigawatts, drawing on home batteries and EVs across the country. Tesla launched its own UK Powerwall VPP in partnership with Octopus in July 2025. Independent platforms like Axel Energy now support batteries from Give Energy, which alone makes up around 40% of the UK home battery market, along with Fox, ESS, Sig Energy, Solax and Solis. The mechanism is the same one grid-scale batteries use, just distributed across hundreds of thousands of homes instead of concentrated in one site. When the grid needs power injected or load reduced within seconds, a VPP operator can discharge a slice of every connected battery simultaneously. For homeowners, the numbers are modest but real, typically 120 to 300 a year from VPP dispatch payments, on top of a further 200 to 400 a year from simply charging on cheap overnight rates and using it during expensive peak hours. Individually, small money. Collectively, a genuinely useful chunk of flexible capacity the grid doesn't have to build a power station to get. It's already sitting in driveways and utility cupboards across the country, just needing the software to tie it together. And there's one more piece, the one that involves you directly rather than a piece of infrastructure. Demand flexibility. Rather than only changing how power is generated and moved, part of the plan is changing when it's used. National Grid's Demand Flexibility Service already pays households to shift usage away from peak times, running the washing machine at 2 a.m. instead of 6 p.m, charging an EV overnight, letting a heat pump preheat a home during a cheap, windy afternoon rather than a still, expensive evening. Trials have shown people are genuinely willing to do this at scale when there's a real incentive. Multiply that across millions of homes with smart EV chargers and smart heat pump controls, and demand itself becomes a genuine tool for balancing the grid, not just a fixed number the system has to work around. So what does a 90% renewable UK actually look like? Less like more wind turbines and much more like an entirely rebuilt nervous system for the country's electricity. New pylons and subsea cables carrying power hundreds of miles from where the wind blows to where the demand is. New interconnectors trade in electricity with an entire continent's worth of weather, grid-scale batteries, and a growing army of home batteries smoothing the hours in between, and millions of homes quietly shifting when they use power without ever really noticing they're doing it. The turbines and solar panels are the visible part, and they're the part furthest along. The genuinely hard, expensive and controversial part is everything that has to change so that power they generate can actually reach a plug in your kitchen, and that part is where the real 90% renewable UK is actually being built, pylon by pylon, cable by cable, battery by battery, right now. If you found this useful, hit subscribe for more of these, and a like genuinely helps the channel more than you'd think.